Let's continue to reflect on the state of the nation, but also South Africa's past, present and future. We're joined by Xolelwa Kashe-Katiya. She's a research-based initiative that would be Indlulamithi South Africa 2035 Scenarios. And Ms. Xolelwa Kashe-Katiya works closely with that. She's the executive committee member of Indlulamithi Scenarios. And Sisi, thank you very much for your time this morning.
Good morning. Thanks for having me. And it's Indlulamithi.
Indlulamithi. Yes. And thank you. Let's start with maybe the state of the nation based on the work that you do. You are a research-based organization. When you take a look at the research, what does it reveal about South Africa in 2024?
Well, the State of the Nation address itself was really anchored around the 30 years of democracy. So the way you received it was as a reflection on the past 30 years, and also the fact that it is an election year, it becomes quite iconic. So the President was focusing a lot on progress thereof. However, what was striking is that the bias was towards, reflection on the legislation, implementation of various policies, without necessarily infusing research in terms of measuring, because you can reflect on the numbers, the number of schools built, or the nutrition programs, but without a baseline that you're working against, then it distorts the picture, because it can sound like a beautiful picture, that of the story of Tintswalo, but if you were to now measure against what it is that we set out to do in 1994, then the picture becomes very bleak.
What is the story of Tintswalo and Njabulo?
Well, the story of Tintswalo...
From your research, not from the President's
From the President's point of view, yes, there are pockets of success. We've seen a more just society that has emerged post-1994. We've got this constitution that enables us to even have a conversation such as this one, where there's various freedoms, such as, expression and so on. But when you look at the reality of it all now, if you were to measure, if you were to look at Stats SA and even the research that we've been doing in terms of the barometer that we've been designing, it reveals that we are in a state of lawlessness. We are in a state where, the coffers, the national coffers, are completely eroded. He did reflect a lot on state capture, which we also look at. However, because we don't see any real consequences, even though it's the only thing that's really focused on as a challenge against all these successes for this child, Tintswalo was born in 1994. But when you look closely at the reality of Tintswalo, the society that Tintswalo is growing up in, it's increasingly becoming lawless. It's increasingly becoming a state where we are losing, faith in our democratic institutions, the very state institutions that are meant to implement all those things. So you'd read the speech, and at each point, you're always saying, but however, what about this? There's corruption, which is endemic. Even with state capture that he reflects on, he speaks about some assets being frozen and so on, but we haven't seen any real consequences. And according to our research, that actually propels us into what we named back then in 2018 as the Gwara Nation, which is that state where now shadow states are emerging because the state is not capable of delivering even the most basic services such as water.
Let's speak on the incapacity of the state to deliver on basic services. So Tintswalo, the 30-year-old who would have been born in 1994, if they go to a hospital, they'd probably be visiting a public hospital, because Tintswalo is not in formal employment. Like you speak of the statistics, right? The statistician general is always at pains to tell us about the specific age group that is out of work. And so Tintswalo is going to a public hospital. What is the state of public hospitals? Because if you go there on the 1st of February and you need to see a doctor, you'll probably be told that, oh, we only have an appointment in May. So you might have to wait 4 months if you're going to a public hospital. Nurses are in over their head because they do not have capacity. And so while the population grows, are we building enough hospitals? Are we capacitating that sector to be able to take care of this population?
Well, South Africa has a great potential in terms of, the infrastructure to have and put up all these systems, such as the hospitals, in terms of capacity, it would be at the highest level, especially where the politics meet the bureaucracy, where now we start to see a disconnect wherein it's difficult to ensure that the bureaucracy that implements the policies or state policies is unable to remove themselves from the party politics. And as a result of that, but also there's also a whole lot of historical issues, the inequalities that continue into the present, that the people who are put in various positions, maybe through cadre deployment or otherwise, there seems to be this inability to implement. I mean, we all say our policies are so great, and we look at them and we've got very progressive policies, when you compare to even some of the first world nations. South Africa is way ahead of time. But it's the people. It's the human resources. But it seems like we are so reliant on the political system to ensure that the ideology is infused into the state without looking at a broader picture. How does civil society fit in? How do they complement the skills or the reach of government? Because they do have legitimacy. We know our governments don't have legitimacy. At the moment, there's a lack of trust in our institutions, especially where there's officialdom. The private sector is also there. How do we tap into the capital, the potential of capital from the private sector, but also skills, managerial skills. You see all it, for example, at municipal level, we're always getting these audits, and we're not doing anything about it. But how about if we were to partner with private sector in a meaningful way in that particular location? So if you're in Secunda, what companies are operating there? There's a Sasol, there's various mining companies. How do you partner with them to ensure then that you close that skills gap? But we find that there's this lack of trust, which is endemic across all sectors. It's not just this particular sector that I've mentioned. There is that lack of trust. Business doesn't trust government, and government doesn't trust business. The citizens do not trust government. They do not trust business. So those are the issues we're dealing with. But if we were to find each other, maybe then we could draw from various skill sets to augment what exists in government.
I really want us to take a look at all the other factors that make up this 30-year-old, right? But when you speak of the trust on the part of government and business, who is running South Africa? Is it business or is it the government? Because you hear a lot, whether it's electricity, whether it's education, we hear a lot about how the private sector needs to come in or how the private sector can save South Africa. And so what is it that we can all rally around, right? Should it not be this here South Africa? Because politics is a revolving door. There's only one South Africa. If it goes down, we go down with it. And so what will it take to convince either party that this here country has to work for its people?
Well, I think one thing we need to really rally about, and it's unfortunate that because we're so diverse as a nation, it's very difficult to find each other. Because when you look at countries where such pacts, which the president's like referring to, these social compacts, they require, participation of government, of business rather. And then that means you have an activist type of business, and that is informed purely by our history. Because if you were to look at, the history where we come from, there's no denying it. It's just that right now we've enabled a situation where we even squabble about the facts of how we got to where we are today. Because our story does not begin in 1994. There are many structural things that continue into the present. And sometimes for a Tintswalo, you find that a Tintswalo's life is even worse than maybe, for example, my life. Someone who was born in the 1970s. Who lived through apartheid into the present. There's also this disconnect in terms of the age groups. You've mentioned that the young people who don't have employment, but they seem to be, yes, there are legislation that are enabling certain freedoms, such as the one to vote that we're going to do this year. But when it comes to fundamental issues such as, how do we close the inequality? Because it becomes intergenerational, and we know what that then breeds, all the challenges that we have, the violent society, and so on. So for me, it would need to look closely at where we come from and get an understanding, a common understanding, and that can be used then as that rallying point where we've got a common North Star, And that is informed by the facts of our history. But right now, history can be hijacked by whoever is deemed to be the victor.
Because Xolelwa, Tintswalo, this 30-year-old, would have probably also struggled to get through school, would have probably used, if they got through school, would have probably used NSFAS. Tintswalo wants to probably get into a postgraduate program, but because higher education is so expensive for a certain sector of the population in this country, they're not able to take their studies forward. They're not able to get into certain industries because they don't have the right qualification or they don't meet the standard. And so you take a look at education in South Africa, where you still find that the privatization of education makes it inaccessible. What are the ideas around that?
Well, for a very long time, we're still going to experience this dual, sense in terms of our education system, because we haven't done anything, again, to close the gap between the haves and not-haves. There are a few who've opted out. There were Tintswalos even before apartheid, and it was TEFSA then, and now it's NSFAS. But look at all the structural challenges that you have at NSFAS, and those have to do with leadership. There's a perfect system there that works. Then it gets fraught with who gets the tender, who does this, and you've seen all the things that have been happening, around NSFAS. And what does that mean in terms of the experience of a young student at a university? As much as you're trying to increase the number of enrollments, of especially, previously disadvantaged Tintswalos, but because of, when I talk about the incapacity, it's not just about lack of skills, but also it's a lack of ethical leadership. If you were to go to even basic education, I mean, the president makes a reference to, for example, the school feeding systems. That is also fraught with, tender corruption. That's at the lowest level, where the SGBs in our communities now have also found ways to interfere with that. So I think one of the things, first, I said understanding where we come from, agreeing on that, but also you need to have a strong leadership that has that legitimacy, that would be trusted to actually drive that message. And right now, because there's a lack of trust, but also the lack of trust is driven by no consequences when corruption is, when we're dealing with corruption. Yes, we found that all our institutions are very corrupt, but what then do we do about them? And is there justice in that? If we were to say we've got this constitution that is so just, that is so progressive, whereas you find that the elite, especially the political elite, seem to get away with so many things. So I would say the Tintswalo story needs to be measured against, there has to be a barometer that says, what did you set out to do? So is it enough to get that RDP house? And
if you get it.
If you do get it also, and we've spoken about higher education. Tintswalo goes to a TVET college, but we know what's happening around TVET colleges. The state is still unable to make those attractive, so that we can have more artisans. And again, it's a thing about capacity. Because there's great potential there, but how come we aren't able to attract our youth to that? And when they finish, who is going to employ them? Surely the state alone is not going to. They can have their programs, but they're not going to be able to employ all those young people.
You speak of ethical leadership, right? And it is sometimes said that the fish rots from the head. So you go to various government departments. Tintswalo, the 30-year-old who was born in 1994, needs a driving license. They go to the department and they don't have a contact. They can't call someone and say, hey, I'm by the door, please come hook me up, right? Then somebody says, well, just put something there. They don't have 100 rand to put there. And so they have to spend probably a week, 2 weeks, or however long it is to be able to obtain that, because you must either have a contact, you must know somebody, or you must pay something. And so things like that, are we putting too much on just the government? Do we take a look at ourselves, Nati, as South Africans? What role do we play in also fueling the fire that is happening?
And you're quite correct. I mean, the work that we've done, what appears as the most positive, scenario is actually informed by all of us, falling in and actually participating. And it's not just about, refusing to pay a bribe, but also how do you become effective whistleblowers? But we know then, there's also the dangers associated with that. But how do you shout Vimba when you see someone getting robbed, as opposed to just watching and thanking God that it's not yourself? But also beyond that, how do we, according to the Constitution, keep our government accountable. Because as long as we're not holding them to account, I mean, they continue thinking that maybe they're doing the right thing, or maybe they will always come back because we keep voting them. But also, it's not limited to just election years such as this one. It's our everyday. How do we, in our everyday and in our different spaces, ensure that we perform our duties as citizens? Because we do have a role in this democracy. It's not government that has a role. And if we're not playing our role, then we are enabling, you know, the state to do as it pleases. Because after that Zondo Commission, a civil society should have risen up to ensure that there's follow-up. Like many other instances wherein there's been revelation of you know, nefarious occurrences happening, but we're not seeing citizens actually, you know, making them to account. And also even with business. You know, we don't see citizens also challenging business, because this thing is about, you know, especially if we are a country that speaks to wanting to be a developmental state, because it does require all those parts to come together. You're correct, it's not government alone. But then sometimes there are those who would say it's deliberate, this issue of not educating the citizens in terms of how to be as citizens.
Xolelwa, we were reflecting on this with colleagues in the morning, that when we were growing up in Malokshin, we had Abo Budi, you know, who made sure that the community is safe. You had Abo Mama, Bebezokuza. You wouldn't be on the street corners doing whatever you like because it would get to your parents or it get to your siblings. And so when you're saying Guti communities need to rise up, how do you do that when you see communities almost numb, right? When you go do your grocery shopping, who do you see? How much do they get? They probably make enough to get to work and not to sustain their living. And so people don't want to lose whatever little bit that they do have in this tough economic times. What is your understanding of what is happening also in our communities, right, where people have to take 3-4 taxis? And even in those environments, there is so much filth, you know, where there's no dignity in the way people are going about their business. What do you do? How do you even rise up?
I mean, at first I had reflected on how I think it could be deliberate, or again, it's the lack of know-how by the state in terms of how it educates its citizens. Because there has to have been some kind of social re-engineering, because we've just come out of apartheid, which was a social engineering project. And then we hoped that, you know, the transition would then automatically make people shift their mindsets. And you see that there's still this hangover. And actually, I beg to differ when it comes to these community forums, because those still exist in townships. It's just that we've opted out, you know, as the middle class. You've got your ADT and your community WhatsApp group. But if you were to go to, you know, townships, Ekasi, you still have those community forums. But then they start operating on the other side of the law, where now there's a bit of vigilantism. And at times, you know, you'd find that some of these community forum type of formations, there's also this idea of, you know, xenophobic attacks that we tend to skirt around, when you find that at times these issues have to do with economics, they have to do with inequalities, they have to do with the challenges of poverty within our communities. But then, because of where we are in terms of the Constitution and where we've positioned ourselves as a nation, then those forums are not formalized. However, if you were to formalize those kinds of engagements where it's not deemed to be vigilantism and resourced to complement the work of the police, maybe we'll find successes there.
You've mentioned the Constitution a number of times. I do wish that we can have you back on so we can take a look at this so-called best constitution in the world. Is it really? So thank you very much for your time this morning. Xolelwa Kashe-Katiya, Indlulamithi Scenarios Executive Committee.